Hey gang, it's Mrs. Klein.
And Mrs. Wilburn, we have your podcast today, and it is going to be a piece of cake.
Yes.
This is Lesson 6, the Declaration of Independence. Your guiding question is, what principles of government are expressed in the Declaration of Independence? We do have some key vocabulary. Your vocabulary words are common sense, Declaration of Independence, independence, natural rights, and petition. So we're going to get started.
Yeah.
We left off with the battles of Lexington and Concord, and that's where this starts. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the start of the fighting that would lead the colonies to declare their independence from Great Britain. The day after the clashes, horseback riders galloped through the colonies with news of the barbarous murders of innocent of innocent militiamen, leaving most Americans deeply appalled. More urgently than ever, they debated what to do about Great Britain.
For many colonists, the two choices were clear as day. The colonies could declare their independence, or they could continue to use protests and petitions or formal requests to sway the minds of King George and Parliament of Great Britain. The second choice would keep the colonies at peace, but at what cost to the colonists' freedom?
No one was more outspoken in his support for independence than Patrick Henry of Virginia, who delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history to the Virginia House of Burgesses. "There is no longer any room for hope," he began. "If we wish to be free, we must fight. Our chains are forged. The clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable, and let it come." Then Henry spoke to those who treasured peace above freedom.
Gentlemen may cry, "Peace, peace," but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. What is it that gentlemen wish? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death.
Despite the passionate words of patriots like Henry, most colonists remained unsure about separating from Great Britain. In this lesson, you will learn how the fighting led many to decide to declare independence.
All right, you guys, and if you're following along in your history book, we're moving on to section 1 of lesson 6. You can find information beginning on page 108. This first section is called The Colonists Organize an Army. So on May 10th, 1775, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. By then, New England militia had amassed around Boston. The first question facing Congress was who should command this New England army? The obvious answer was a New Englander.
Of course. Next section, George Washington and the Continental Army. John Adams of Massachusetts had another idea. He proposed that Congress create a Continental Army made up of troops from all of the colonies. The delegates agreed. They unanimously elected Washington to be commander-in-chief of the new Continental Army.
All right, and now we're going to talk about the Battle of Bunker Hill. Meanwhile, militiamen near Boston made plans to fortify two hills that overlook the city, Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. The fort was concerning to British General William Howe, who had just arrived from England with fresh troops, so he ordered an immediate attack. About 2,000 British troops formed two long lines at the base of Breed's Hill, and at Howe's order, the Redcoats marched up the slope.
Putnam ordered his men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." So guys, a little background on Putnam. He was a commander of the Patriot Defense at Bunker and Breed's Hill. He left a very lucrative life as a farmer and innkeeper to volunteer after Lexington and Concord. So he was also an officer in the French and Indian War. All right, so don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes. The red lines of British soldiers broke and fell back in confusion. On their third attack, the Redcoats finally took the hill, but only because the Americans had used up all their gunpowder and retreated.
Yeah, we were kind of low on supplies.
Yeah.
This clash, which became known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, was short but incredibly bloody. More than 1,000 British troops and nearly half that many Americans were killed or wounded in the conflict.
Okay, the next section, General Washington takes command. Shortly after the Battle of Bunker Hill, George Washington took command of his new army, made up of a mixed multitude of people, under very little discipline, order, or government.
A month later, however, a dismayed Washington learned that the army had only 36 barrels of gunpowder, enough for each soldier to fire just 9 shots. To deceive the British, Washington started a rumor in Boston that he had 1,800 barrels of gunpowder, more than he knew what to do with. Luckily, the British believed the rumor, giving Washington time to send desperate letters to the colonies begging for gunpowder.
In desperation, Washington sent a Boston bookseller named Henry Knox to Fort Ticonderoga to round up some big guns. Now, big guns, artillery,
Cannons,
yeah,
like the cannonballs, the munitions and things like that you'd fire out of the cannons.
everything that Washington did not have.
Yes.
A few months earlier, militiamen led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had seized the fort. As winter set in, Knox loaded 59 cannons onto huge sleds and dragged them 300 miles to Boston. Boston was about to be under siege by the Americans.
All right. Yeah, pretty big deal that they were able to capture those cannons and then come back and use them against the British.
I have a great video that we're going to be showing about this too.
There we go, about that.
So, yeah.
All right, the British abandoned Boston, you guys. On March 4th, 1776, the British soldiers in Boston awoke to a frightening sight. The ridges of nearby Dorchester Heights, which had been bare the night before, now bristled with cannons, all aimed at the city.
Rather than risk another battle, General Howe abandoned the city. Some Americans hoped that the victory in Boston meant that the war was over. Washington, however, knew it was only the beginning.
There we go. All right, moving on to see what happens on the eve of independence. Most colonists at this time, you guys, still considered themselves loyal British subjects, and they believed their quarrel was not with Great Britain itself, but with its policies toward the colonies.
So the Olive Branch Petition.
Yeah.
Many Americans pinned their hopes for peace on King George. In July 1775, the Second Continental Congress sent a petition to George III asking him to end the quarrel.
By the time the petition reached London, however, the king had declared the colonies to be an open and avowed rebellion, and he ordered his ministers to bring the traitors to justice.
Okay, and that's going to bring us to common sense.
Yes.
Early in 1776, a patriot named Thomas Paine published a fiery pamphlet entitled Common Sense, in which he scoffed at the idea that Americans owed any loyalty to King George. Paine also attacked the argument that the colonies' ties to Great Britain had benefited Americans.
Paine ended with a vision of an independent America as a homeland of liberty. Within a few months, more than 120,000 copies of Common Sense were printed in the colonies. Paine's arguments helped persuade thousands of colonists that independence was not only sensible, but that it was the key to a brighter future. Okay, so a few weeks after the British left Boston, the Second Continental Congress appointed a committee to write a declaration or formal statement of independence. The task of drafting the Declaration of Independence went to the committee's youngest member, 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson of Virginia.
Jefferson's job was to explain to the world why the colonies were choosing to separate from Britain.
All right, and so they had to decide on the principles on which to base a new government. Okay, Jefferson's explanation was simple but revolutionary. He based his arguments on the principle of natural rights, the idea that all people are born equal in God's sight and thus are all entitled to the same basic rights.
Governments are formed, Jefferson said, to secure these rights, and their power to rule comes from the consent of the governed. If a government fails to protect people's fundamental rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it.
All right, and so the second part of the Declaration of Independence is basically like a breakup letter with the king. And so they also were talking about the king's crimes. Mm-hmm. So King George, Jefferson continued, had shown no concern for the rights of colonists. As evidence, Jefferson included a long list of the king's abuses against the colonists. And they had demonstrated that he was unfit to be the ruler of a free people.
The final break. On July 1st, 1776, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia's State House to debate independence. By the end of the day, the issue was still undecided. The next day was cooler and calmer. On July 2nd, all but one of the 13 colonies voted for independence, New York casting no vote.
Okay, there was a bit of a debate about slavery, however. The delegates liked most of what they read, except for a passage on slavery. Jefferson had charged King George with violating the sacred rights of life and liberty of a distant people by carrying them into slavery. And almost no one liked this passage. Even delegates who opposed slavery felt it was unfair to blame the king for enslaving Africans. So this passage was removed from the document.
Okay. On July 4th, the delegates approved a final version of the Declaration of Independence. When they signed the document, They pledged to support independence with our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. This was a serious pledge because every signer understood that by signing, he was committing an act of treason against Great Britain.
And if you were caught committing an act of treason, you're a traitor, you were hung, right?
Yeah.
So this was definitely not something that they were taking very lightly.
Okay, let's just review what we learned in this lesson. The colonists organized an army. Number 1, George Washington took command of the Continental Army after the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Continental Army used cannons brought from Fort Ticonderoga in New York to force the British to abandon Boston in March 1776.
And on the eve of independence, the failure of the Olive Branch petition, remember the king didn't even want to look at it, and the success of Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense moved the colonies closer to the decision to actually declare independence from Great Britain.
Then we've got Thomas Jefferson drafting a declaration. Thomas Jefferson, a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, was selected to write the Declaration of Independence.
And then finally, you guys, there's the final break. On July 4th, 1776, the delegates approved the Declaration of Independence. But remember, they took out anything that had to do with slavery, however. For the first time in history, a government was being established on the principle of people's natural rights and the duty of government to honor those rights.
Okay, guys, remember, knowledge is power.
All right, I believe in you.